My particular interests are in the modeling of natural phenomena, so I tend to be more comfortable, or at least have been, in writing down some interesting mathematical equations and seeing if they can actually do something useful for us. Why is the visual part important? Well, we don't need that much to ground us in it. We could talk about some former despot having a hole in his head, put in by a bullet, or we could see a picture of it. And most of us who actually read an article about Gaddafi getting shot in the head said, where's the picture? And of course, pictures were very quickly forthcoming, and it was an extremely, you take or leave your picture, it's quite repulsive, but it's quite interesting how important that visual depiction is in terms of creating a very deep impact. The idea of adding visual embellishment is an extremely old thing, and certainly the narratives that people were constructing, even in these old cave paintings, are really interesting. From a computer graphics perspective, if you look up here, you can actually see they're using displacement mapping. They're actually using the part of the cave to actually create texture. And so when we think about depiction generally, we think about this idea of some story that's told largely in a visual way. And it's got a long history, and there's a ubiquity of consumption. We watch movies, we go to art galleries, we consume things off YouTube. But there's less in terms of the actual ubiquitous content production. The typical situation is for an expert to create beautiful things that we consume. And there are many ways in which we might want to communicate visually. It might simply be to create some simple animation one sends to one another. We might want to share a virtual environment. We may want to just write the equivalent of visual poetry. We have actually no relatively few manifestations of that in an electronic form. And as a consequence, we really haven't explored those possibilities, and the current tools don't really allow it. You have to understand the nature of perspective in order to tell a story with it. And in this Rembrandt, it's very interesting the way perspective and light is used. To understand how carefully the light transport problem, the physical light transport problem, was solved by Rembrandt. He's got self-shadowing of the garment and then a shadow over top of the self-shadowing. It's really a virtuoso performance. And this idea of depiction has been around forever. So when we look at these sorts of things, they never really stand still for us. They're telling stories constantly. And these are our attempts in computer graphics nowadays. So they're very realistic, but I'm not sure they tell the same story. Is that we also have other aspects that are very strange. If you fixate on the cross, some of you may see green. There's no green there. And how many people see the little spots disappear every once in a while? And we see animation. So all that's happening there is selective turning off of one magenta circle. That's all that's happening. But we're seeing green, we're seeing motion, we're seeing things disappearing. I actually love illusions because, in fact, they're not. Here we have a good example of A and B there, in which B looks like it's lighter than A, but of course they're the same shade. We have a great example here where this appears to be a different shade from this, but if you look carefully, they're the same shade. We have stereotyping that's extremely interesting that's going on. If we look at, for example, just putting lines onto this guy, and we have signal processing that for some reason allows us to cue into the stereotype of a light female who's kind of relaxed and happy versus the equivalent male. It's quite remarkable the kind of signal processing that's going on when we deal with these signals, when we deal with a visual representation of any sort. We process faces extremely interesting way. Let's fixate on that cross and watch what happens to the ostensibly nice-looking people. Are people seeing funny faces? At any time, you can focus to the right or the left, and you can see perfectly good faces, but you fixate on the cross, and you kind of sometimes see some weird faces. But they're real faces, and this is just visual processing. So at any given time, the signaling that's going on is quite interesting. This is how visual depiction is decomposed in a regular system. There's a modeling component, there's an animation component, and a rendering component. Every one of them ends up in a production having probably about 50 people in the credits to a movie for each of those pieces. And much of the graphics pipeline that I'm talking about there is tailored to a large set of experts, not non-experts. So we're solving this computational depiction problem for experts, but not for amateurs. And because, in fact, experts are way less demanding in a funny way than amateurs. Experts are prepared to ride that learning curve, potentially for years. Amateurs aren't. So that's one of the reasons why people drop their guitar lessons after a few lessons and so on. I think visual communication is something that is actually underrepresented relative to, in the technology that we have, relative to the capabilities our technology does have. It's so far self-limiting because the problems we've been looking at are those of the accuracy of depiction, and less so the usability and the tools that can be provided to general users. How do we get past the cultural and perceptual coding issues? How do we get past the impasse of the regular high complexity software that we have and put something that's, put creative tools into the hands of people so that they can actually further explore visual communication? So that's actually the challenge, and I've been looking at some of the solutions, or some possible solutions, and our laboratory, but I would say right now that the results are partial at best. There's an awful lot of work to do regarding how we improve the input-output problem. Really, it ends up being an input problem. How do we allow users to be expressive without having to get onto this very long learning curve? I could speak an awful lot more about this, but hopefully this gives you a taste for some of the questions I'm interested in, and I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you.